Ready for Miss Smith. Kara, we are live.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this special presentation. Whether you're joining us live online or live in person, we are thrilled to have you with us tonight for this community dialogue focusing on there is a skid row in every town. Tonight, we are joined by a few special guests. Including Ross Attenball of the Flagstaff Shelter Services and Dr. Douglas Mungan, who will be giving tonight's presentation. Before we start tonight, we want to give you some of the background of the Live Black Experience project, where this project came from and why it is so important for the conversations that we're having in our community. The Live Black Experience project started in June 2020 in celebration of Juneteenth. Because of the pandemic, we moved the celebration virtual and we engaged in a community dialogue about the history of Juneteenth and why it's so important to the Black community, not just in Flagstaff, but nationwide. And after that conversation, we heard a resounding "give us more" from the Flagstaff community. That led to a strategic group that came together to develop a strategic plan for the city of Flagstaff, which was adopted later that same year as the Live Black Experience Community Strategic Plan. After that, we continue to engage in these monthly dialogues that were aimed at focusing on and educating the community about important issues relating to race, space, segregation, and the desire for racial reconciliation across this nation, in Flagstaff in particular, throughout the state of Arizona and across our nation. And as we continue to have these conversations, we hope that you'll continue to join us and participate and partner with us in sharing these important stories, engaging in these important conversations, and moving forward as an entire and whole community. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Deb Harris to share a bit about the Murdoch Center. Then we'll hear from Ms. Ross about the face of homelessness, and then I will give an introduction to our guest speaker this evening. Ms. Deb?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I want to welcome you to the Murdoch Community Center. The center is a historic center and it is operated by the Southside Community Association, and we are a 501c3. And it's really fitting that we should be doing this program at the Murdoch Center because just right outside our building is a little park area that is filled with homeless or unsheltered people throughout the year, even in the wintertime. And so this is a perfect setting for this conversation. And I welcome you to it. Please participate through the chat and ask any questions that you might want and take part in this community conversation because this is our issue as a community and not just one person's or one organization's issue. So thank you again for joining us. And I think that's it. And I think we have our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Ms. Deb, and we will turn it over to Ross to give us a bit of that background on the face of homelessness here in Flagstaff.
Hi, I'm Ross Schaefer, and I am with Flagstaff Shelter Services. I'm really honored to be here tonight with everyone in this incredible discussion happening in our community. Northern Arizona has a lot of great service providers, and still we know it's not enough. Flagstaff Shelter Services, for instance, we are the largest emergency shelter in Northern Arizona. We have over 200 people staying with us each and every night. during the day, having day services for people to come in, access showers and clinic and laundry and all of that kind of stuff. But we still know that people, whether they are choosing to not come in or they don't feel comfortable or it's an access issue, we know that there's still a lot of people that are unsheltered in our community. And the point in time count locally in Coconino County every year sees 400 plus people experiencing homelessness. And while that's not a huge number in comparative to larger cities, it is a huge number of people. In my opinion, one is too many, but 450 people or so, that number continues to grow because of COVID. Maybe not just because of COVID, but that certainly saw a huge increase. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge there's really a long history of significant racial justice and social disparity issues around people experiencing homelessness and access to services. It's something that I know our agency is taking a really hard look at and doing, I think, what is frankly uncomfortable work sometimes, but necessary. And I think that the larger homeless service systems, not only locally, but nationally in our country, have a significant stain on them and have major work to do to make sure people have access. So I'm really glad to be here, a part of the conversation, and to hear from Dr. Munjin tonight about his experiences and how we might be able to apply that here locally in our own community. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And now here to frame the conversation for us tonight is Dr. Reverend Bernadine Lewis.
Thank you, Sister Kara House. This conversation this evening, I would imagine, is going on all over the world, all over the nation, and if not, it definitely should be. And so this is definitely the mission of the Lived Black Experience Project, to bring to our audiences those topics that are sometimes difficult, that are oftentimes not wanted to be heard. And so therefore, the Lived Black Experience Project exists to bring these topics to the forefront. And so when we think about Skid Row, those of us that have been on the planet for a while, I think our minds would automatically go to California. And I'm really looking forward to this evening's discussion, where the presenter, Dr. Munjin, will perhaps give us the history of Skid Row in its origin, in that it started out as a logger's name or title, Skid Row, and that's the original Skid Row was where loggers, I think, resided. And so I'm anxious to hear if my memory of history is correct. But as in the English culture, American culture, words have a tendency to take on new meaning. And so Skid Row, when we often hear it, we automatically know that that's not a good area of town, a safe area of a town, not just California. I would say that there is a Skid Row in Flagstaff, a place where shelterless individuals find themselves in a certain part of the community where they know they can set up temporary housing. And we know that these people are often the unwanted in our communities. But I would remind us, as we have this conversation this evening, no man is an island, And if we ask the question, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, indeed, we are. And so that is why we must come together as a community, have this conversation, support projects such as those led by Ms. Ross, who just gave us some opening remarks. And so this is a not so delightful topic, often scary, but nevertheless, we must have it as a community. And so with that being said, we, the Lived Black Experience Project, we are very pleased to welcome our presenter and to be in this space to have the conversation.
Thank you so much. And it is my pleasure this evening to introduce you all to Dr. Douglas Mungin. Dr. Mungin is a professor at Solano Community College, where he has been the director of forensics since 2016. He received his master's degree and PhD in performance studies at Louisiana State University and completed his undergraduate studies at San Francisco State University. His research explores the performance of space and identity, ranging from the creation of abject spaces, gentrification, and homelessness. Taking an interdisciplinary approach to communication studies, he employs critical race theory and theories of mobility to explore how we understand and engage cultural differences across aesthetic practices. His work has been published in Text and Performance Quarterly, Texas Speech Communication Journal, and Oral History Review. He is currently working on a book that traces the impacts of socioeconomic neoliberalism on the performance and political movements of homeless communities in the United States. Dr. Mungin is one of the most sought-after instructors and mentors at Solano College. He teaches public speaking, argumentation and debate, intercultural communication, and persuasive speaking. He is also a club faculty advisor for the Communication Studies, Poetry, and Law program. Welcome, Dr. Mungin. Oh, sorry, Dr. Mungin.
I'm gonna turn on my mic.
I don't think you can turn that off. It has to stay on.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Live Black Experience for inviting me here. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I think that Flagstaff is an important space to have this conversation. The entire mythos of this area is that there is a problem out there in the abyss, and we will take whatever resources we have to fight it. And historically, that has been Flagstaff's ethos, and hopefully we can also utilize those resources and that passion to find resources, to find solutions to problems in addressing this issue of homelessness in unhoused communities. So a little bit about myself. So once again, my name is Dr. Douglas Mungin, and my work deals with homelessness in unhoused communities and the histories of those communities. So a little bit about myself. So what brought me to this work is my life. So at an early age, I dealt with housing insecurity. At the age of 13, my family lost our home. We had to move from different apartments in different spaces, sleeping out of cars until we finally found a one-bedroom apartment for 7 people. And then during this time period, my father and my mother, they divorced. My father had a really deep addiction issue that impacted him for most of his life. At the age of 17, I became estranged from my father. I did not see my father for another 2 years. It wasn't until the birth of my daughter, Billy, that I started to want to kind of get that connection back to my father. I didn't know where my father was until I heard from my aunt that he's currently living on Skid Row. Now, as a child who grew up in LA, hearing that your father lived on Skid Row means that the worst possible outcome outside of death happened to one of your family members. So I went to go see my father in Skid Row. Now, for those that know of Skid Row is the largest unhoused population in all of America. Since the 1980s, it has been a center and it has been a symbol for poverty, for addiction, and for the unhoused issue of America. And so when I saw my father there, I started to have conversations with him about why he was there, kind of like the last 10 years. And one of the interesting things about our conversations was that in the last 5 years, he had gotten his life together, but he decided to stay in Skid Row. And he lived in a single room occupancy hotel. He was doing volunteering there. He had a large collection of friends, of social networks. And I asked him, if you have money now and if you have all of these resources, why do you still live here? And he answered me by saying, this is my community. This is where I feel safe. This is where I feel wanted. And it was at that moment in time that I realized the way that I thought about unhoused communities, the way that I thought about poverty and homelessness completely flipped, where there's something about these communities that allows for these people to find a sense of hope, to find a community that they felt was lost. And so I started to do this research on Skid Row, and eventually it expanded out into kind of looking at other areas within America that suffered from homelessness issues. And then that drew me into the history of these areas and of these communities and how they draw back all the way to the turn of the 20th century. And so as I started talking to my father about these issues of Skid Row and how it's connected to all of these other spaces, he just told me, it was like, yeah, that's crazy. There's a Skid Row everywhere, but this is the headquarters. And I looked at my dad and I told him, I was like, you know what? You haven't given us a dime in over 10 years, but you gave me a hell of a title for my dissertation. And it was at that moment in time that I knew that this was going to be the work that would last for the next however years of my career. And so that's kind of my entry point into Skid Row, of understanding it as a community, but specifically looking at it in regards to how it impacts the social surroundings, not just of those communities, but of the larger communities of those cities. Now, there are 5 key issues that I want to talk about, or 5 takeaways that I hope that you get from this conversation. The first one is that homelessness is not just a modern issue, that this issue dates back all the way to the turn of the 20th century, and that it's been a part of the conversations of cities and areas since that time period. Number 2, most communities have treated homelessness as its dirty little secret, where we don't necessarily talk about these unhoused communities, that we drive through them or we move around them, and therefore they don't exist until they become too much, until it becomes a critical mass of individuals. Number 3, every bootstrap, isolation, and displacement strategy has been tried over and over again and has failed. And that's going to be one of the things that we're going to talk about in this conversation in the next 30 minutes, and specifically how we can move away from this type of displacement strategy that most cities begin to utilize. And number 4, homelessness is an outcome. Now, when we talk about homelessness, I think that for a lot of us, we want to immediately address the issue. There are homeless people on the streets, therefore they need to be removed or they need to be put in housing. But one of the key things that we realize is that most people end up homeless because of various factors. And we're going to talk about what those factors are. And it's not until we address those factors that we can actually solve for the issue of homelessness. And then finally, there are people. And I think this is the key takeaway, that sometimes when talking about this, that we forget that these are our community members, that these are people that went to our schools, that these are family members, that these are aunts, these are brothers, these are sisters, these are mothers, these are father, and unfortunately, in many cases, they're also children. And it's important for us to realize that these are people's lives. And so when we are making policy decisions, when we are interacting with people on the streets that are unhoused, that we still have to remain human. We have to remain humane and realize the humanity of these individuals. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our panel presentation, but these are the 5 key takeaways that I want us to really grapple with as we begin talking about this issue.
Is he
Mic
still
is on.
All right, there was a technical difficulty. Hopefully we got that situated. So a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. I want to start off by talking about kind of the current state of homelessness in America, and specifically the unhoused populations in Arizona. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on Skid Row. And hopefully we can find some parallels between what's going on now in Flagstaff and some of the policies that were enacted in Los Angeles during the 1960s and 70s that led for the eruption of Skid Row that we know of today. But what we're mostly going to focus on, though, is this history of homelessness. And in this history of homelessness, I hope that you're able to see a lot of similarities in regards to tactics or rhetoric that we utilize when discussing unhoused communities, and how that same rhetoric follows us into 2022. And then finally, we're going to discuss some indicators and hopefully some solutions to help this large issue. Now, when I first began doing this research on homelessness about over a decade ago, my research advisor said, like, you know what, this is a pretty local issue. I'm not necessarily sure how big this problem is going to be or how many people are going to be interested in it. 10 years later, homelessness has become like the key factor or the key issue for most cities across the United States. And so just in the last 10 years alone, we have seen the conversations about homelessness or unhoused communities really become a part of our daily dialogue in discussing cities and city policies. And so there's a couple of statistics that I want to frame to help us frame this issue. So in 2021, or 2020, there were over 580,000 people who experienced homelessness within America. So 18 out of every 10,000 people. And unfortunately, the numbers post-COVID have not come out yet, and we're expecting to see those numbers increase dramatically. Next, 6 out of 10 people experiencing homelessness were staying in sheltered locations, and nearly 4 out of 10 were unsheltered. The number of people experiencing homelessness nationwide increased by 2% from 2019 to 2020, or more than 12,000 people. And that marks the 4th consecutive year that the total homelessness level has increased in the United States. So we're seeing that this is an issue that has been increasing for the last half decade. And then finally, the overall increase was driven by increases in the unsheltered homeless population, meaning that we're seeing more people on the streets than ever before. So between 2019 and 2020, the number of people counted in unsheltered locations rose by 7%, or 14,000 people on the streets. And so this kind of leads us into talking about, homelessness. Well, like, it's a California issue or it's a big city issue. And we start to realize that it's an issue that's now impacting almost every American city. So the population of homelessness, over half of the people experiencing homelessness come from 4 states. So California is about 28%, New York 16%, Florida 5%, and Texas about 5% of that population. California accounted for more than half of all the unsheltered people in the country, accounting for 113,000 people in 2020. This is nearly 9 times the number of unsheltered people in the state, with the next highest number of Texas. So in California, where I'm from, we're experiencing homelessness on a level that has never been seen before in American history. So states like Oregon are ranked 5th, and Arizona is ranked 11th in the country right now in regards to homelessness. But I think one of the issues that Arizona is experiencing, and a lot of other areas are experiencing now, is the hidden homeless. So this specifically deals with rural homelessness. So 7% of rural residents suffer from homelessness. And people who experience rural homelessness are called the hidden homeless, because we don't see them on city streets, but we do see them when we go out into kind of the more rural areas. And so many rural homeless people live in places we do not see. They often are sleeping in the woods, campgrounds, cars, abandoned farm buildings, and other places not intended for a habitation. And so we saw that this level of homelessness raised from 14% to 16%, and also 64% of rural counties had high child poverty. And so this is becoming one of the populations that we're seeing being impacted the most in regards to homelessness. The second biggest, students. And so 39%, so in a 2019 study, 39% of respondents were food insecure in the previous 30 days. 46 of those respondents were housing insecure in the previous year, and 17% of students in a nationwide study were homeless in the previous year. Now, when we talk about homelessness, I think for a lot of us, we imagine middle-aged individuals, specifically men, but right now we are experiencing a homeless epidemic in student populations, specifically within college and high school students. And so when talking about this issue, I think it's really important to understand the severity and the necessity to act on this issue now. And so that brings us to Arizona and why the Live Black experience brought me here today. And so as of January 2020, Arizona had an estimated of 10,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given day. And public school data reported that in 2018, 2019, that an estimated 21,000 public school students experienced homelessness over the course of that year. Of that total, 602 students were unsheltered, 2,000 were in shelters, 1,900 were in hotels or motels, and 13,000 were doubled up in some of those shelters or homes. And so when we talk about these new issues in regards to shelters and homes, I think it's important for us to kind of suss out what we actually mean when we talk about housing. And so housing, in regards to kind of like the research, deals with things such as rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, Project Home Key, which allows for individuals to get homes, and emergency housing vouchers. So when we talk about housing, this is what we're talking about. But unfortunately, for most cities and states, a lot of energy is being put into temporary programs. And so those are like projects Room Key, where it allows for individuals to stay in a hotel room for a certain amount of time, or even tiny homes, which have a finite amount of time that individuals can stay there. And then the third category we have are shelters. And these are like the day and winter shelters that we are probably most familiar with. Now, I don't attach the word permanent to housing, because research shows that even placements in housing are not necessarily stable and permanent without wraparound care. And I think that's the key, that just throwing houses at people is not going to fix these issues. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But also, it's important to note that to fix homelessness, we actually do need permanent housing too. So like that, so in order for us to make sure that we put a dent on this issue, we have to have wraparound care. And so that leads us to my research today on Skid Row. So Skid Row represents this really unique place in American history. So most large American towns had a Skid Row at some point. So the term Skid Row comes about from the early parts of the 20th century through old logging towns, where they would skid the logs down this one row of town where they would then be manufactured and then shipped off to somewhere else. And so in these little areas of downtowns, you had young men coming to look for work, and then there were bars and single room occupancy hotels. Things were cheap around that area, so young men would come in, find quick jobs, and then move on to the next location. Now, in the 1940s and 1950s, that began to shift a little bit. So you had these young men, they would come into town, and for many of them, they just wouldn't leave because they found housing, they found shelter, there were things around that caught their interest. But unfortunately, in the 1940s and 50s, we saw an epidemic in regards to alcoholism. And so you start to see like the very first shelters and missions emerge in these downtown areas. And so the 1930s and 40s represents kind of the changing of our downtowns, where we now see missions and we see food banks for individuals being present. And so for most of these American cities, they were specifically these unhoused communities or these Skid Row communities, they were middle-aged white men. And then in the 1960s and 70s, that began to change. Specifically with the influx of the second Great Migration of African Americans, the Latinx populations moving into more urban areas. And unfortunately, in the 1970s and 80s, the crack epidemic and other drug epidemics that hit those areas. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But Skid Row, the area in Los Angeles that I do predominantly of my research is a 10-block area located on the eastern side of downtown Los Angeles. So Los Angeles County is the homeless capital of the United States, consisting of 4,000 to 8,000 people total in regards to homelessness or unhoused communities. So 4,000 to 8,000 people live in this 10-block area of Skid Row. So Skid Row is the home for over 30% of the city's shelter beds and contains a majority of the city's homeless shelters. So we call this area a service center ghetto, meaning that if you are poor and broke and predominantly Black, you go to this area to find resources. And I'll talk about this in a second of how this led to the creation of Skid Row. So in 1958, the late 1950s, most cities across America started to redevelop their downtown areas. So earlier I was talking about how downtowns were filled with predominantly middle-aged white men. In the 1950s, they started to uproot these men and started to turn downtowns into more commercial areas, more areas of business. And so in Los Angeles, we saw the destruction of Mount Hill, which was a community of lower class individuals. That community completely went away and more industry came in. We also saw this in Seattle. So Seattle, we now see more industry. New York, the Bowery District, we start to see that emerge. Chicago, which had the biggest Skid Row in the 1950s, also was wiped away in their downtown area. And so in Los Angeles in the 1970s, they wanted to finally finish the job. And so they created which was called Project Blue Book. So in 1972, this project came along, which was going to dismantle this area of Skid Row and turn it into an industrialized commercial area. Now, the people who were working on Skid Row, specifically the agencies, were doing a great job. The missions were doing a great job. And they were like, hey, let's just keep a little area like this, but let's develop more housing in this area so that we are able to take care of the homeless population and they can all be in this area. Now, the city councilmen, they were like, that seems like a good idea, but we're not sure. But what took it over was the fact that outside communities outside of Skid Row also didn't want these people in their areas. And so in the 1960s and 1970s in California and across America, you see this defunding of mental hospitals emerge. And so with the defunding of mental hospitals, you start to see more boarding homes come into different areas of the city. And you have people not wanting those type of people around in their areas. And also in the 1960s, you have more incarceration, people coming out of jails, and you also don't want those people in your cities. And so we see cities like Santa Monica, Venice, and Los Angeles. We also see these kinds of cities in like Chicago. They don't want these people in their area. And so what emerged was called Project Silver Book, which was the creation of outside city leaders and also agencies within Skid Row to make Skid Row a confined area where most of the city can place the unwanteds. And so it becomes this area that was deemed to be a place where, like, hey, if there's an individual that needs help and needs assistance, Skid Row is the place to go. Now, unfortunately, one of the big things that was supposed to be attached to Skid Row was housing. And unfortunately, that housing never came because LA's commercial center in the 1970s emerged and at a level that LA didn't actually understand at that time. And so that allotted land went to businesses. And so therefore, there's more homeless people coming into Skid Row, but now the agencies don't have the capacity to actually help these individuals. And so what happens is that Skid Row becomes larger and larger. And then in the 1980s, you have the large crack epidemic, and you also have the large incarceration rates, and you also have a large mental health crisis that happens in America. And so Skid Row becomes this epicenter of poverty, of mental illness. And then in the 1980s, other cities started to realize Skid Row existed and started to bring their homeless population into Skid Row. So from the 1980s to the early parts of the 2000s, there are narratives within Skid Row communities and agencies and people who live there of Greyhound buses coming in the middle of the night, dropping people off from other states who had no idea where they were, and those people were left on Skid Row. And so you have this area now filled with trauma and filled with not enough resources to take care of the people who are there. And so now in California, we have this issue where we now have great recessions and depressions, and homelessness is not just relegated to Skid Row, it's across all of the cities. And I think that we're able to see that now, even in places like Flagstaff, where you have a concentrated area of service agencies. But you're now seeing those people move out of those areas into other areas. And that's kind of where I want to go today. Why do people, specifically, why do these tent cities emerge? Why do these homeless communities emerge, and where do they come from? And I think in order to kind of understand our present, it's vital to understand our past. And so the early iterations of homelessness began in the early 19th century. So what we may call homeless subjectivity appears with the emergence of the railroad. I know that there is a big railroad that comes over here. The story of Flagstaff is actually the story of that railroad, of how individual, like it becomes a logging town, it becomes the place of the observatory, it becomes vital for this particular area. But very much like Flagstaff across the nation, we see these railroads become central in regards to our early ideas or iterations of homeless bodies. And so when work was done, these individuals would illegally ride the trains from city to city, looking for temporary work as farmhands in rural areas or factory workers in unions. And that's where we get the term hobos. They were young men defined by their constant mobility and limited existence in an emerging industrial economy. And so what's interesting here is that at the late part of the 19th century, we had the Civil War. And so for most of the people who were traveling these trains, they were veterans of the Civil War. And so you start to have this really large class of former military individuals who are now homeless or who are unhoused looking for jobs. And so the first big homeless issue that we have is with veterans. And so when we now see veterans having the issue of homelessness, we understand that this dates back to like the first wars of America, that veterans have always been negatively impacted when it comes to services and not getting the services that America has claimed that they were going to give to. But what's interesting, and what I'm really interested in, is kind of the rhetoric that we have around homelessness. And this rhetoric of kind of morality of homelessness emerged in like the 1910s, 1920s with Taylorism, the industrialization of the American body. In order to be a good American, you have to work. If you're a good worker, it means that you are a moral person. Therefore, if you didn't work, it means that you suffered from some form of immorality. And so you start to see the emergence of these boarding homes in the 1910s and 1920s, where they would take these unhoused men and they would work them, and they would have to work for their stay. And so by working for their stay, they would be able to get food, they would be able to get housing, and therefore they would become better men because they worked. And you start to see this kind of rhetoric emerge throughout the 1920s, where we start talking about homelessness not as an issue of a lack of resources, but as an issue of morality. But that changed with the Great Depression, where we start to realize that just because you worked hard doesn't necessarily mean you are going to get the resources or the money that you deserve. And so America suffered a large unhoused issue. And so individuals were losing their houses left and right. And what emerged were these Hoover Bills. You might have heard of these Hoover Bills in your history classes, but I think Hoover Bills are a really interesting footnote in American history. And I think it links into our current conversation of tent cities now, where when the federal government or local state government does not provide for you, we as people, we find communities that will provide for us. We find communities that will give us the resources that we need. And so these Hoover Bills were a collection of poor people who pulled their resources together in these really dilapidated areas and started to form these large-scale communities that were seen as blights on many of these working areas. But this issue of Hoover Bills leads us to this kind of like idea of communitas that I'm really interested in. And so communitas is that feeling that comes unexpectedly and unites various individuals. It defies deliberate cognitive volitional construction, and it's the opposite pole to social structures. That means set rules or set status, and the status sequences consciously recognized and regulated in society. These are responses to a lack of social services, where we as individuals try to find community when there are no communities present for us. And I think we see this a lot within our own tent cities and within our own unhoused populations. And I saw it with my father, where when an individual doesn't have resources, they go to communities very much where they're at. And then they start to pull those resources together, help other individuals in those communities. And then there's a power in that community. And I think what we're missing in our conversations in regards to homelessness is, what are these individuals finding in these communities that they're not getting in our normal society? And I think that's a really interesting entry point that we can have when discussing these homeless encampments and what we can gather from them. But additionally, the way in which we frame these encampments is also very similar to how we would frame them back in the 1930s. And so women and African Americans were mostly impacted during this time of the Great Depression. In many northern states, Blacks accounted for 15 to 27% of people in homeless centers. And I think that's a part of like the Black experience and Black history that we don't actually talk enough about, is that connection to unhoused populations and how that's a big part of the Black experience of finding homes and finding resources, and tying that together into kind of an overall civil rights strategy. Housing needs to become a structural component in how we have these conversations. But to kind of frame how like these communities were viewed as violent or filled with drugs, I like to point out this 1935 Seattle Times article of a pair stabbed at house party in Shacktown, dealing the stabbing in a Hoover Bills community in Seattle. A huge Negro with a gold tooth. I love it how even that stereotype dates back to the 1930s. Stabbed two other Black men on June 24th, 1934, at the climax of a house party. The author, while being hesitant on calling the shacks houses, shamelessly gave a monstrous depiction of the Black attacker and of King George's Place, the home of the victim, who the author mocked through a liberal usage of italicizations, apostrophes. These exaggerated, almost barbaric descriptions were central to the sensational journalism style that helped to widen the gap between Black and white civilization, but specifically of Hoover Bills communities, and framing them as these dangerous spaces. And I think that we are able to see some of the same kind of description of these homeless and tent communities now, where they become cesspools of like drugs and violence, and that they need to be cleaned or wiped away. And so we start to see this rhetoric of cleanliness, of dirtiness attached to human bodies, to human people and their conditions. And so what happens when we label an individual as dirty or rotten? We need to clean that individual, or we need to wipe them away from this particular area. And so that's some of the things that we really need to watch out for when discussing these communities. But a turning point here is the federal transient program of 1931, where the federal government decided to actually put some resources into helping this issue of homelessness and of lack of jobs. And so in 1931, the federal government sent out a bunch of money to states in terms of grants, saying, hey, start up a bunch of programs, let's start to build infrastructure, and then these people, specifically young men, can find jobs. Young women can find jobs in the service industry, and then they would then be able to find homes from there. Unfortunately, a lot of states did not like the fact that people would be on the government dole. And so they denied this grant money. So they declined it in many cases and said, no, we don't want people dependent upon the government. Now, many of you are probably like, oh, that sounds really familiar to some of the conversations that we're having now. And we're starting to see that, like, when I talk about like understanding our present, we need to understand our history, that we're following into the same kind of cycle in the ways in which we talk about poverty in America. And then in 1935, the federal government completely did away with the program. And then we saw the Dust Bowl. And so for most of Arizona and California, most of our residents come from Oklahoma. We start to see that big move in the 1930s. Now, what really interests me about this Dust Bowl migration was that, one, in 1935, that's when the federal government cut off the grants for the Federal Transient Agency. But number two, what emerged was the first time that state governments came together in order to kick poor people out of their cities and specifically set up regulations to disallow certain individuals into their towns. And so the bum blockade of 1935 was a movement within California where the Los Angeles Police Department, spurred on by the Los Angeles City Council, Business Council, decided that there were too many poor people within Los Angeles. And so these poor people needed to work. And if they weren't working, then maybe we can put them into programs where they can like work for meals and work for housing. But outside of that, the LAPD decided, we don't want these poor people here anymore. And so they worked with the Arizona government, the Nevada government, to basically close the border for all individuals coming from Oklahoma. So when they came by train, they had to show that they had enough money in order to live in the state. And if they looked poor, they then were not allowed in the state. And so what's interesting here is that, like this idea of like whiteness kind of emerges during this time period where whiteness isn't necessarily attached to white bodies. Whiteness is an idea. So even white Oklahomans weren't allowed into different states because they didn't fit this ideal version of what a citizen of that state looks like. And that person being poor does not belong in that state. And so we start to see how rules and regulations, and specifically laws against poverty, begin to emerge in city centers during 1935. But also a big part of this is the Repropriation Movement of 1929 to 1936. So during this time period, over 400,000 to 2 million Mexican Americans were deported from Arizona, California, and the Western states back to Mexico, even though these individuals did not come from Mexico or have no ties to that particular land. And so when this occurs, where you have this huge deportation, also with this huge movement in terms of regulating who can stay and who can not come into your place, we start to see the emergence of like these borders, these artificial borders emerge, and also this war on poverty begin to emerge in our American society. And so that takes us to the modern age. And so in the 1950s, we see the second Great Migration, specifically coming out of Arkansas and Louisiana, Georgia, where my family's from, and we start to see a movement now to the West Coast. So instead of going to Chicago and to New York, like the first Great Migration, the second Great Migration now moves to the West Coast. And so we now start to see these laws in place against poverty and against certain classes of people as a large influx of Black individuals start to move into the states. But also we see the increased urbanization of city centers in the 1960s. So now we start to see more wealth disparity emerge, where poverty becomes more intensified, but also white flight of the 1960s and 70s, which then takes a large amount of money outside of these cities and urban areas and places them into the suburban areas, where now resources and roads to build up these areas now have to go there instead of these urban centers. And then the drug boom of the 1980s, the decrease of funding of mental hospitals in the 70s and 80s, the tough on crime movement of the 1980s and 90s. So what's interesting about this tough on crime movement is, number one, the easiest way to get arrested during this time period was to be poor or homeless, because we had nowhere to put them, because there weren't a lot of shelters. And so therefore, in California, I believe 25% of the population of prison in the 1980s are in jail, were because of some type of homeless policy or vagrancy policy that was there. But unfortunately, when those individuals come out of jail, the only programs that were there were in Skid Row. And so it became this cycle where an individual was arrested because they were homeless, they would go to jail. When they came out of jail, the only resources that were available to them were back on Skid Row. And so you start to see this cycle emerge, but also more people being incarcerated in the 1980s meant that they would go to Skid Row. And so you start to see how this can really boom this area in regards to population. And then in the 2000s, we start to see gentrification where people who were from suburban areas move back into urban areas. But the problem with gentrification is not who moves in, it's the lack of resources that were there when those people were asking for them. So when Black and brown populations were asking for resources, these resources were denied. And it wasn't until certain bodies moved back into these areas that these resources were then given. So parks were cleaned up, streets were cleaned. We start to see like more businesses emerge. And so we start to see now in the last 20 years of how these cities look much nicer than they did in the early 90s, but also the level of poverty and wealth disparity is at a level that we haven't seen in American history. And so to kind of wrap up this conversation, I think it's important for us to discuss some misnomers when it comes to homelessness and things that can predict, not necessarily predict, but situations that can lead an individual to homelessness and hopefully some solutions out of this. So the first personal indicator is poverty. If you're poor, you can't afford a home. So 11.8% of Americans live in poverty. And I think that especially now with COVID and with the Great Recession, we're seeing more people live paycheck to paycheck. And then when that occurs, they get kicked out of their apartments or homes, and then therefore they have to live in cars. We're now seeing more Americans live in cars than ever before. The second one, and I think the one that most people focus on, is addiction. So approximately 2.1 Americans have an opioid addiction. We're starting to see studies that there has been a 59% increase in alcohol use, increases in opioid overdoses, and rises in suicidal thoughts and drug overdoses since 2020 because of COVID. So right now we're seeing an epidemic in regards to drug use and in regards to suicide because of COVID. That was already present pre-COVID, but now it's getting even worse. And I think when most people think of homelessness, this is the main thing of like, hey, these people are addicted, and so therefore that's why they're homeless. But in actuality, we see that in most cases, domestic violence is probably one of the biggest indicators of homelessness, that 10 million women and men per year are in the case of domestic violence, and more than a third of DV survivors report becoming homeless immediately after separating from their partner. So 1 in 3 people become homeless immediately after separating from a DV situation. But also, one of the unspoken of populations in American society is those living with disabilities. So 17.7% of the US population has a disability, whereas 42.8% of sheltered homeless adults have a disability. So 42% of individuals who are in shelters are those with disabilities. Now, it's one of those issues that we talk about resources of like, how do we give people resources? And one of the things is also, how do we give people resources with disabilities before they get to this level of homelessness? And I think that's one of the things that we don't talk about enough. And then finally, incarceration. Up to 15% of incarcerated people experience homelessness in the year before admission to prison. That one of the key indicators of if a person is going to go to prison or commit a violent crime is if that person has been homeless in that year. But also another big population is youth and child in CPS, Child Protective Services. That many of my friends and many of the folks that I meet on Skid Row were formerly foster children or foster youth. And unfortunately, this is a large population of those individuals. Now, in addition to personal indicators, there's also societal factors. Number one, rise in real estate prices. I think that we're all feeling that right now. And this, especially in Flagstaff, we're understanding how rental prices can price out a generation of individuals. But number two, limited services. And I think this was the problem with Skid Row, where you have amazing people working at services. And I think this is one of the things that we don't talk about enough, is that the people who are working in shelters and working in like homeless services, have been doing an amazing job for the last 60 years, but unfortunately, we don't give those people enough ammo to fight this battle. And I think that part of the fix is also making sure that we provide more resources and services and money for those services in our cities. But the biggest factor is NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So in most cities and states, the ways in which we zone has a big issue. That in a lot of cities where we have residential zoning, we don't allow for certain type of high-rise or high population buildings. And so therefore, we're not able to get enough people there. Secondly, we have areas where it's zoned industrial and industrial only, meaning that we can't put any residential businesses there, residential services there. And then we just have people who don't want services in their areas, where we don't want a homeless shelter. We don't want a addiction shelter in our area. And so therefore, those services go to one certain area of the city. They become service center ghettos. And we see what happens with Skid Row when we place all of our services just in one area. That this issue of homelessness isn't an issue that one part of the city has to fix. That all of the city, all of the state needs to come together to fix this issue. We can't just rely on certain areas to just basically do the dirty work for us. And this leads to apathetic governance, where governments don't move unless there is a big issue in terms of homelessness. Right now, governments across the nation are now talking about homelessness and these camps. But for 10 years prior, these conversations were not being had. And so we need to make sure that this remains an issue, that housing remains a key issue in regards to any type of policy that we talk about. And then the other factor is aggressive policing, that when individuals are on the streets and they are arrested over and over again, that they will never find permanent housing because of this aggressive policing, because of not being safe. And so in the last couple of years, we've seen some policies emerge, and these policies have failed. The first policy is busing the homeless people out of your area. We see this every time there's an Olympics. In 1984, Los Angeles tried to do this with the homeless population there. In 1992 or 96, the Atlanta Olympics, we saw a huge busing issue happen there. And what we see is that these people come back because these are their homes, or the issue of homelessness impacts a different area. Number two, tearing down of encampments. This has been a huge issue in the last couple of years, as we see that these cities and states are now become more aggressive in tearing down these encampments because of, one, they become cesspools of drugs and violence, et cetera. It's all of the rhetoric that we talked about before. But number two, there's rarely any wraparound services for permanent housing after this. And so this leads to increase in incarceration. This leads to individuals not having anywhere to go once those encampments are taken away. And basically the encampments move to other parts of the city. Number three, incarceration. We find that this doesn't work at all. Just locking up homeless people or people who are poor doesn't actually work. Those people still come out of jail poor or homeless. Number four, strict borders, meaning that we don't allow homelessness in certain parts of our city, as if there is a magical line in which poor people and people with means can live. And we're starting to see now that that doesn't take place, that if an individual is going to sleep in an area, they're going to get into your area. But also this goes back into that NIMBYism, that this isn't an issue that only certain parts of the city should deal with, that this is an issue that the entire city needs to deal with. And then finally, vouchers for limited short-term housing. And unfortunately, this has been the de facto strategy of the last year of let's get these people quick homes, or quick motel rooms so that they can be out on the street. And so these are great, but they lead to two issues. One is spatial triage, meaning that we throw vouchers at people just to get them off the street and don't really necessarily care about their wraparound care. But number two, it allows for this myth of shelter resistance. So if a person continues to move from voucher place to voucher place every couple of months, they get tired of moving. And so we have this idea that's well, they don't want to live in shelters anyway. They don't want to live in shelters because they're not permanent locations, that they constantly have to move. And so there's this uncertainty about life that emerges. And like we were talking about, this idea of communitas, that people are drawn to social situations and surroundings that they can feel safe in, that they can feel community in. And by moving them from place to place, that community never emerges. And so we're able to see how these failed policies emerge. But there are some solutions. Number one, permanent housing and reparation. Damn right. Permanent housing that cities and states and the federal government needs to do a better job in regards to getting more permanent housing. But number two, which is not located here, is that when having these conversations about housing, we also need to get landlords on board. I've been working with some organizations in Oregon right now that also bring in landlords for these conversations, that they are at the ground level in regards to making these market rate prices. And so if we're able to discuss with them a lot of these issues, then that works. Right now, there's very limited communication between the federal government and the voucher system. And in many cases, if you were to go to the voucher system and see like the houses that you can rent, most of the landlords have no idea that they're even on that list. And so we have this discrepancy in regards to actual vouchers and what we actually have available for those people. But number two, an increase in temporary beds, that in order for us to get the wraparound houses, we do need to make sure that people are off the streets. So hotels, motels are a temporary solution as we get to our more permanent housing. But like I was saying, affordable housing is the key. Decrease in incarceration. Another big key here is education, that these are all societal issues, that homelessness doesn't just emerge out of thin air, that homelessness emerged because of a failure of our social networks, of our social safety nets, that individuals end up on the streets. And then finally, more trauma-influenced counseling. Being unhoused for a day is traumatic. And I think that's a part of the situation that we don't really talk about enough, is how much trauma influences these discussions of homelessness, our unhoused populations. And in order for us to actually talk about this issue, we also need to bring trauma-influenced counseling back on board. And so these are some solutions. I would love to discuss it with you all and specifically talk about what's going on in Flagstaff, what has been done in the past, what are some solutions being discussed, and just your thoughts about it. So thank you all so much. And if you're interested, please go to my website, drdougmungeon.com, where you can find more of my research. Next year, my book on Skid Row will be coming out, so I'm really excited about that. That's going to be published by Beacon Press in February, so be on the lookout for that. Or if you have any questions whatsoever, I would love to talk to you. Just contact me at douglasmudgeon@solano.edu, and you can also find the slides on the Facebook website for the Live Black experience. So thank you all so very much, and I'm excited for our panel discussion.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you all for the contributions that you had to this conversation. We're going to start diving into some community questions. We had some come in from our audience. I have several put together based off of your presentation in particular, but let's just dive in. So first, I noticed that all of us, as we were talking about the experience of homelessness, we were very careful in using the language of people experiencing homelessness versus homeless people. And I'm wondering if you can just share with our community why that language is so important and why it's so important to have that people first language. I'm sure some folks might not know what that is. So if either of you or if any of you can speak to what that is and why it's so important for the conversation.
Okay, I'm happy to, I can explain why I think it's important. And I have had the opportunity to, work with lots of school kids and just people across the community. And I think that having person first language really respects and honors that this is an experience that someone is going through, as opposed to what is the defining factors of that human being. And so I think when you hear people say homeless, there's a homeless person down the street, or there's a homeless kind of thing, I think that it's really taking away the dignity and the humanity of the human being that is experiencing that lack of housing.
I agree. That's
I don't think you can add any more to that.
Well, and the next question is really related to that for you specifically. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your personal background and experience and the experience of your father. And I just found that so important as part of the conversation. So can you share a little bit about why it's so important for us to associate real stories and to contextualize homelessness and the realities of homelessness in that way?
Yeah, I think it's important because, one, it's an experience that a lot of Americans have been touched by in some way, whether it's personal, someone in their family or a friend has suffered or has been unhoused in some capacity at some point in their life. But number two, I think for me, I think it's important for that personal note, because this is my experience, right? Like, my research is defined by who I am as a person and my identity. And I think that a lot of times researchers don't put themselves into that position. And so in order for me to talk about people who are at the most vulnerable level of society, I think it's also important for me to talk about that vulnerability. But also, as a Black person, I think that homelessness and specifically housing insecurity is a big part of the Black experience, unfortunately. And so I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had a little bit more, and specifically talking about how it's constructed politically, but also in regards to policy also, that it's not just a personal or cultural aspect of our lives, that these are political mechanisms in regard that leads to housing insecurity, and that we actually need to address that. And there are real people who are connected to these issues, that we're not abstract statistics.
Ms. Deb, you shared when you were introducing the Murdoch Center and just the Southside community, the importance of this topic to the Southside in particular and to the park adjacent to Murdoch Center. Can you share that a little bit with the audience again, just so that they have that context of why this topic is so important to one of the neighborhoods in Flagstaff?
And I think I've probably been associated with the Murdoch Center for probably about 12 years now. And throughout all of those 12 years, that park, Little Pocket Park, has been next door. And there has always been a group of unsheltered people living there. And so when we talk about the Southside neighborhood, this is a neighborhood that was predominantly people of color. And so the park is there, but there's a lot of things that go on in that park that prohibits some things that could be happening in the center. And so when we talk about that, people want to automatically say, oh, you want to get rid of all the unsheltered people in the park and get rid of them, and so it's not your problem. But that's not what we want to do. What we want the city to do is to take some ownership of why those people are in the park, in the first place. And so we want them to be a part of this community. but we want them to also get the services that they need that we're not able to provide, and so it's not just our problem. Just like I said in my opening statement, is that this is our issue. This is our issue as a community. And until we figure it out, we're going to continue to have conversations, like this. And part of it is having that moral courage to do what you need to do as a community. And that's a lot easier for me to say than it is for people to do. And I was just going to jump ahead a little bit, because when Dr. Mungian was talking about college students, we had a young woman who had aged out of the adoption, out of foster care. So she turned 18, and once she turned 18, they were done with her. No services or anything. Well, she wound up at NAU, which was a good thing, Northern Arizona University. And that young woman, with the support of faculty and staff in the university programs, she was able. She's now a social worker. So she got an undergraduate degree and she got a master's degree, and she started the food shelter at NAU because she understood what it was like to be a student that did not have the resources of all the other people around her. And so that's a population that just kind of slips through our crack, slips through, is that unsheltered. Now, the university, it just sits right, 3 blocks away from the South Side. We have a lot of students that live in the South Side, and so at any point in time, any of those students could become unsheltered, without a place to live, because they all don't have parents that can afford to pay their rent. A lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. And so, it becomes an issue for all of us. And that's the part that really frustrates me, is that other people aren't thinking about it like that. So that's why I say Flagstaff first.
Amen. I'm really glad that you brought up that community aspect of it too, because one of the things that was really striking in your presentation was talking about NIMBYism and zoning and all of those factors that come into housing and homelessness and community health. So I'm hoping each of you on the panel can just talk a little bit about why it's so important, not only to recognize those as contributing factors to homelessness, but also, and maybe Dr. Mungian, this part will be more for you, maybe for Ross as well, but if you can talk a little about the origins of those things and some of the racial disparities in the nation, and how that discrimination formulated so many of our historical zoning policies, so much of that not in my backyard rhetoric and that narrative, and why it's so important for us to recognize that if we want to move forward towards solving homelessness and housing and community health.
I think that what we continue to see, and Kara, I think it's a great question, and one that, at least in my experience and working with both this population of folks, but also trying to put the pieces together of federal funding and state funding and local funding, and how they all how many restrictions those funding pools, and just frankly the terrible things that are baked into our systems that continue to keep people, mostly people of color, in a position where they're not able to make the same choices. And I think that we see it. So there was you've heard me probably talk about this, Kara. There was an article in the Times about a study that was done in Richmond, Virginia, and it sticks out to me because I'm from Richmond. And so it's around the pockets of housing that are in really specific target neighborhoods where the Department of Housing and Urban Development actually gives extra points to services to put programs in those communities. And it studied the timeline, or it studied a timeline of where it was literally like 10 to 15 degrees hotter in these communities. Because there were no trees, there were no sidewalks, there was no funding put in to make these communities where low income folks were living, no parks, no playgrounds. And so you really start to realize that there's just like all this health stuff associated with people living in these communities. And so I think that to get to your point and probably just to keep talking, I think we really see it over and over and over again, codified in our communities in ways that really are keeping people back, holding people back, or holding people down into the circumstances that they are in, that they have found themselves in.
Yeah, I think that even in a place like Arizona, realizing that reservations exist goes to show that like racialized isolation in regards to kind of housing, policies are a part of the fabric of our nation, right? But then you also go into things like redlining. Then you go into certain businesses are only allowed in certain neighborhoods, and so you start to see the infrastructure of our communities and just the aesthetic of our communities. You can start to see like what is prioritized and what's not prioritized there. But in looking at just like even how like homeless or unhoused communities or poor communities, one of the big issues in Skid Row was that, like you were saying, like there were no trees, there were no trash cans. And so one of the big things is like, hey, there's trash all over the street. These people are dirty, but there's like no trash cans there to be there. There's no bathrooms, there's no showers, there's no any kind of services that people need for health in order to survive. And so we start to see that it's not just about like aesthetic practices, that these are survival things that aren't necessarily put into these communities that are necessarily a part of it. But moving on to the more macro scale, the NIMBYism, that I think that a big part of like the next part of these conversations need to be in the ways of talking about how we zone specific areas of our cities. And I think that part of it is like we only zone high population or high density buildings in the poorer parts of our town. And there's been a lot of studies that have gone to show that a person's income increases the more they are connected with people of a higher income. And so when you put more people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, like with more middle class individuals, those people move up because we realize that social networks exist, that people have better connections to jobs. But if you continue to put poor people or homeless people next to each other, like what you're doing is just replicating the same system, especially when you're not putting additional services or jobs in those areas. And so I think that this is a multifaceted approach that we need to have, but it's going to be one that also looks at how we think about policies and how we think about how we craft our cities as a legal concept, not just as a communal concept.
Did you want to? I definitely wanted to join in on that particular question. Hello, everyone. And I think that here in Flagstaff, that is a conversation. Ms. Deb talks about needing to have the hard conversations, right? And I think that's a hard conversation that is past due. It's past time to have that conversation. When you look at the fact that we have a regional plan that dictates we're going to do high density, right? Yet every single time something taller than 2 stories comes before council, it's a problem. When you look at the fact that we as a city has said that we would like to have housing for everyone all over our city, yet we're only able to build, it seems, housing in specific neighborhoods. You talked about the concentration of putting certain types of housing in certain neighborhoods. I can tell you, for example, in the last 10 years, really the only place that hasn't had an issue when it came to putting affordable housing would be the Sunnyside neighborhood area, followed by the South Side, followed by La Plaza Vieja. And when you look at the individuals who live in that neighborhood, the lack of resources, just recently, council decided to take away, quite frankly, it was a urban garden, right? It was a community garden in the Sunnyside neighborhood area And Sunnyside has 10% of the population of the city of Flagstaff. This is a 1 square mile. They have one park, and that park is under, I think, an acre. I think it's a half-acre park in that particular neighborhood. There was a community garden that was next to the BMX park. And the concept was, we're going to go ahead and put 13 affordable housing units there. And when people in the community, some people said, hey, maybe you should put that in a different area of town because this community garden is absolutely important. There was huge blowback that, oh, you guys just don't support affordable housing. You don't support workforce housing. It's like, no, we support all of that. We would also like to see other communities or other neighborhoods within our community also support that. I'm going to bring up the sunflower patch, right? This is a piece of property that is located in Cheshire. It's on a bus line across the street from a school. There's a bus line as well as a bicycle line. And the concept there was 28 affordable housing units for seniors. And the pushback was, oh, well, how are they going to get into town? Do they have cars? It's going to be costly for them to travel there. At the same time, council was having this conversation. Council was talking about the Climate Action Adaptation Plan. And we were talking about the fact that we need to minimize our carbon. And many people were like, well, if people can't afford to live here in Flagstaff and work here, maybe they should go to Winslow and drive in. See, there's a contradiction with that, right? There's a contradiction when you hear statements like that and you say what we value. It seems a lot of time in our community, we value open space. We value the pretty scenery, the mountains. We definitely value the concept of, how would you say it? Fresh air. We value addressing the climate, but we don't value the people that live here. And you have to stop and wonder at what point are those individuals part of the conversation or not part of the conversation? And those are the types of hard conversations that we as a community truly need to have.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I want to give Ms. Deb, you a chance to speak to that as well. I tune into a lot of city council meetings. I actually recently spoke at a meeting with you in terms of an affordable housing development. And the statements that were made were basically that we need to remember that affordable housing belongs everywhere, and just reminding city council of that progress that they are hoping to make. At the same time as they were moving forward another project in one of the 3 historical communities of color, which tend to be the 3 communities where affordable housing is allowed to be developed. When it's anywhere else, you get the pushback and it's backed away from. And there was some real pushback to the comment that was made. So I'd like to give you a chance to speak to that and what your goal is in speaking into that desire to see affordable housing everywhere as part of every neighborhood.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I spent a lot of time over the last year visiting city council by Zoom and any other technical means. It is important for us to have those conversations, and it's important for people to step up and be courageous. And like I always say, that's a lot easier for me to say than it is for people to do. But until all of us find our voice and come to city council and say, you're here to support every single resident in Flagstaff. You need to make decisions that are going to be good for all of us, not just for the people who maybe donated to your campaign, because they don't want, and I have nothing to lose, so I can just speak very freely. Those people donated to your campaign, and so you make the decisions or you vote in the way that they want you to vote. And so when I spoke at city council, I talked about having workforce housing in every single part of the city. And that goes back to what Dr. Mungeon said, is that you can't put all of your affordable or workforce housing in one area because people won't, they don't get a chance to interact with people who might have something to share with them. Oh, maybe you should try this, and this is how I did it. Maybe this is something that you might want to try to maybe help you out of, maybe increase your income or whatever. And so if you've got the same people that don't have those resources all together, then how do they kind of learn, And so I guess that's the point for me, is that the affordable housing, workforce housing needs to be all over the city. I live in Ponderosa Trails. Everybody knows that. And the only affordable workforce housing in Ponderosa Trails is right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. There was a developer who came to city council. And this is some of the reason that I decided to run for council. And council argued and argued and argued about one issue. And the developer, they were going to give us 20, I think, affordable housing in 60. So they were going to build 60. I believe that's it. Correct. I know somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. But they were going to build 60 units, and they were going to give us 20 affordable housing units. And I was thinking, that's 20 people that are going to have a place to live. But they voted it down, mainly because the people in Ponderosa Trails were very vocal. Even though I lived in Ponderosa Trails, and I spoke out, for them to build in Ponderosa Trails, because I think it's a good place. It's right there on the bus stop. So they didn't do that because the people in Ponderosa Trails didn't want that. And they spoke out really very firmly against it, And so that's unfortunate, but that happens a lot in our community. Yeah. And so hopefully we're going to figure out how to change that. And so people will have to come out of their comfort zone and thicken up their skin and run for city council and see if they can make a difference. So we'll see. But that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask what might be a little bit of a controversial question, but I hope that you will stick with me for it. So one of the things that you shared, Dr. Munjin, was the impact of COVID-19 on homelessness. Mm-hmm. And what it called to mind was a recent study that was published in Social Science and Medicine, which found that white people surveyed in the United States cared less and were more likely to shun pandemic safety precautions when told of COVID's disproportionate impact on Black communities and other communities of color. The conclusion for that study noted that empathy was lost when it was no longer seen as, quote, a white problem. Can you and any of the panelists just talk about the historical and modern danger of viewing homelessness and other social disparities as not white problems, or viewing things only through a white lens of relevancy?
I think we're experiencing that now in addressing the issue of homelessness, that more white Americans are homeless, and so therefore now it's become an epidemic. In the 1980s, when that was the case, it was like, well, we just need to be tougher on crime. Mm-hmm. It was more of a moral failing. And I think that you're able to kind of like see that lack of empathy in different pockets, and not just in regards to homelessness, but in other social issues too. But I think COVID also, we're able to realize just how wide our wealth disparity is, and just kind of the conditions that we're living in just our American cities, and the lack of resources, not just in regards to just like monetary resources, but of health resources too. And who are these people who had to work during the pandemic? That these were predominantly communities of color serving more affluent communities, that, like are the workers, like we had our workers are our heroes, but they don't get a day off and they don't get hazard pay. And also I get to yell at them because they're wearing a mask. And so we start to see that there were two Americas that were present during COVID. And unfortunately, we also see that there are two Americas whenever there is a wealth disparity or a housing disparity issue also. And hopefully we're able to make enough inroads during this time period that now it's on everyone's radar, so that we can build more infrastructure in regards to helping this issue in regards to our Black and brown populations, but also realizing that we can't stop this fight, that we're starting to realize housing is a human right, that a lot of the issues that we experience in our society can be solved with affordable housing, like in regards to education, in regards to healthcare, in regards to just sanity and living our everyday lives, that having a home and not being fearful of that home being ripped away from us is vital as a human being. And I think hopefully we can get to that level soon.
Nobody wakes up in the morning and decides they're going to be homeless today. It just happens, you know, before you know it, it's there. One, you know, catastrophic medical issue could wipe any of us out. You know, and so it is all of our problems, because it could be us. It could be somebody, you know, in your family. It could be, you know, someone that you know that is in that situation. And I think that that's a part for, I think people realize that in the back of their heads, but I think they're afraid to think about it.
I think that we suffer as a society from a lack of empathy, right? I think that, you know, we are taught to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We forget that back in the day, no matter how rural the community, everybody might have had their own ranch, but when it was time to raise that barn, everybody showed up to raise the walls of the barn. There was community input. We forget that when Mrs. So-and-so became a widow, for some reason, each house, one day a week, somebody sent over a basket that had eggs in it. There was always an extra loaf of bread that was dropped off, right? Someone cooked a little bit extra something and gave it to somebody. We forget that even though we were taught to be individuals, there was still that community. And the only reason why we have the interstate system is because we all pooled our money together via taxes to pay for it. You know, I can't afford my own fire truck. I can't afford my own, you know, water treatment plant. I think people forgot that we got that by pooling resources. When you look at the issue of lack of affordable housing in Flagstaff, and you talk about, is it a colored thing, for lack of a better way of putting it? It's interesting the conversations that come up when we talk about affordable housing. You know, we were trying to use any other word but affordable housing, right? They don't want to use affordable housing, so let's use workforce housing. Right? So then we're trying to not to use workforce housing, because which workforce? So then we tried to bring out nurses and police officers and teachers, right? That didn't even work. But I remember I was talking to Councilmember Odegaard about this. I'm sure if these numbers are not correct, somebody will definitely correct me. But in a 2-year time period, we managed to preserve 3,000 acre feet of open space. The whole community came together and rallied around that. I think we built in that same amount of time 3 units of affordable housing. And those just kind of slipped through because they didn't have to go before and get a rezoning and have people show up for it. And we talk about poverty with a view, and I'm like, it's only poverty with a view if you actually get to look up and see the mountains. But the majority of people work 2 jobs here. They go to work when it's dark, they come home, they change clothes, they go back to work, they get off when it's dark. They never get to see this beautiful view. And again, I just think that there is an extreme lack of empathy when you are concerned about everything else but actual people. I think that Flagstaff is an absolutely beautiful community. I think it's beautiful not because we have the peaks and dark skies, but I think it's the people here that make this community beautiful. And slowly I see those people leaving because we care about everything else but them.
Anything to add, or?
I mean, I think this is, I think my experience has certainly a different lens for a lot of reasons. I think that COVID I mean, I can tell you as a service provider during COVID, Kara, you're on the board of Flag Shelter, and I think as a service provider during COVID, I can, it's hard for me to talk about that, those original early days, the first year and a half or so, much like I'm no different than so many people, but just in the sheer number of people coming in, the increases specifically around in the indigenous population of folks coming in need of services. Just explosion of people needing running a congregate shelter in the very time that it's forbidden to congregate is something that is still really difficult to talk about. But I think that what the experience gave a lot of people, and a lot of white people, was the lesson that your health is my health, and that you might call someone an essential worker, but if you knew that they went to a congregate shelter at the end of the night in a pandemic, but they were bagging your groceries during the day, is that okay with you? And do you feel like you're still in a healthy position? Do you still not understand that housing is healthcare? And so I think that there are really it's a big sigh and painful for me to hear, and I'm sure everyone that's listening to hear, that those studies were done, and that just once again disappointing information coming out of research that says that bias is still so significantly there. I do think that there are some people that get it more because of personal effectiveness.
Yes.
And what, I guess maybe that lesson is okay to learn today. Yeah. If it helps it tomorrow.
One of the things that really kind of haunted and lingered with me was your language of the hidden homelessness. And I imagine that would resonate with a lot who know the background of the LBE strategic plan, and part of its title being Flagstaff's Forgotten People, in that sense of invisibility within this community. Why is it so important to shine light on the invisible in our communities? And particularly, why should this topic resonate with communities of color?
I think that it's a part of the larger issue, right? Like that it's not just an issue of cities and rural, that we're all part of this issue of affordable housing or the lack of, and that we're all humans and we're all members, whether that's urban area or rural area. So I don't want to, and also we realize urban and rural has historically been used to politicize and to separate certain populations, specifically white poor people and black people, black poor people. Like that urban rural divide is used over and over again to separate two classes with really aligning interest. And so I think it's important that we really erase that barrier if we want to actually address this issue of homelessness and address this issue of poverty overall. But in regards to your second issue of like this hidden homelessness and why it's important for Black populations, I think that you're seeing more and more Black and brown folks moving to rural areas. I think that's where the housing is now, and we're moving out of urban areas. I know like cities like San Francisco and Oakland lost a significant amount of the Black and brown population over the last 20 years. And we're seeing an exodus more into rural areas. Heck, I saw flags. I was like, hey, what's going on with the real estate over here? Everyone's like, please don't. But I think we're starting to see like just how interconnected all of these systems are, especially like where we're at in terms of just like the housing market, where we're at in terms of the economy, that like these issues aren't isolated anymore. And that to be Black in America also means to be Black and rural. Like we're going back to where we came from in a lot of cases, where we're moving back to Georgia, we're moving back to Louisiana, back to Florida. So we need to address these issues because there are still Black and brown folks who still live in those areas. And like that issue of poverty hasn't left those areas in over 50 years, and we still haven't addressed it. So I think it's time that we finally address it as a collective.
One of the things that really stuck with me as well was the story you shared from that 1935 Seattle Times. And it was particularly striking in the linking of the rhetoric of what's dirty and what's undesirable, both between homelessness and Blackness. Can you talk a little bit more about that historical link and what it might tell us about the nation's history, both with Black dehumanization and with the dehumanization of those experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, like the history of Blackness in America is like we're the spot in America. Like that's kind of how we've always been defined as like it's something that needs to be scrubbed away. Our essence, our history is something that like is a stain on American, you know, the American culture, American society. That and so just kind of the concept of being Black in America means that you are an outsider in America, even though most of our families have been here since the start of America, or even before America was America. But I also think that in regards to like urban areas of just like our presence is automatically deemed as when a Black family moves in, the property goes down. Like I remember living in Louisiana, I moved into this one place, predominantly white area, and our neighbor couldn't sell their house. And then I overheard it was like, yeah, we can't sell the house because a Black family moved in next door. And now you're starting to hear cases of like when white real estate people come in and like they value the Black home a little bit less if there's a Black family living there than a white family. And so you start to realize how our economic system is connected to this idea of Blackness, but also kind of going back into this like affordable housing issue of like, there's a reason why we build certain housing in certain areas and why we don't build certain housing. And it's like, there's this issue of, do we not think that certain populations have anything to give certain communities? Right? And so if we refuse to build certain housing in a community, it means like those people can't bring anything into that community that their experiences are not necessary. And I think that's a big part of the conversation. And I think that we need to start having a little bit more of like this connection to poverty and to not just a lack of resources, but a lack of value as like communities and identities. And I think that's that empathy part we were talking about earlier. It's like, do we not have empathy towards poor people, but also do we not think that they have anything to give to our communities? And I think that's an issue that we need to address.
My last question, and I'd love to open it up if anybody else has questions tonight within our audience, but one of the other things that you shared during the presentation was that the population of Skid Row is predominantly Black and male. And what really struck me in that was that fact in comparison to the disproportionate imprisonment numbers, the disproportionate, really the vanishment of Black men in our society and our communities. So the question to the panel is, do you see a correlation in those sorts of statistics? And if so, what do you think it is and why do you think it is?
Let someone else start off that answer.
Let me just see if I have this question. So you want to know if there's a correlation between the prison population and the unsheltered?
Yeah, so the correlation between the disproportionate imprisonment of Black men, the disproportionate representation of Black men in the population of Skid Row, and the really the claim of absenteeism when it comes to Black men in society.
Yeah, you know, when you come out of prison, it's really hard for you to get a job, somewhere to live, all of those things that you just need to survive. If you don't have a strong family support around you, and a lot of, Black men don't. And that doesn't mean that their families don't care about them. It could be that there wasn't very much family that's left, and so there's nobody there to help, help them up, help them get reestablished, because those families aren't there anymore, or maybe they're distant, relatives that really didn't know this this person that well. And so what happens when they come out, if they don't have those wraparound services, they end up back either in prison or they end up on Skid Row or one of the places. And it's depressing. They, you know, they maybe go back into drugs that lands them back in jail. So it's like this vicious circle, you know, and they've been dealt just a hand. If, you know, they didn't choose that hand that they got dealt. And sometimes you know, you have to have resources to help pull you up out of a situation. You can't do it because you don't have bootstraps, you know. People say, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, how can you pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any boots? You know, so, but people don't seem to understand that. And I have known young men that have gone to prison, and when they came out, it was really difficult for them to make that transition back, but they had strong families around them and they were able. But then I look at some of the other folks that maybe they were with and they didn't have those folks that could help them. So they ended up back in those spaces, you know, again, or on the streets, you know. So yeah, I think it is a correlation if, you know, and I don't know, it's really just, it's probably just, it's sad, you know, it's what it is. And it's hurtful. That you have to see our young men in those situations, you know, and so anyway, I think I'll just stop right there.
I also think it's hard to overcome a situation when you make a mistake before the age of 20, and that mistake follows you for your entire life, in which your identity, your jobs, what you can't even really get a college loan because of that. So like your opportunities are taken away from you because of a mistake. And I think that like there's a big connection between that, where if you don't see an opportunity, or if you don't see a goal, or if you don't see something positive at the end of it, like what is there to really live for, and in a way, outside of just kind of like your immediate care or your immediate, like what you want at that point in time. I have a good friend who was my best friend growing up. I reconnected with him recently, found out that he was on Skid Row for about 10 to 15 years, and he's doing better now. And luckily he had like family to kind of get him out of it. But even talking to him, he made a mistake and it was so difficult for him to get out of that mistake. And I think that part of it is that we throw people away. And that's kind of why Skid Row exists, because it's a place where we put the people we don't want anymore in our society, or that we just don't care about. And I think that we need to start reassessing the systems that we create that continue to do that, right? Like there are laws, there are policies in place that we can change to make sure that this cycle doesn't continue. But because we still connect everything to this kind of like moralistic charge of like, they're just a bad person because what they did at the age of 18, or they're a bad person because they grew up poor, that we don't give access to a better future to some individuals. And in order for us to like, in order for that correlation to change into something more positive, we need to start to like really set up structures and set up systems that allow for those individuals to make that change that we demand them to make. Because right now we're demanding change and we are giving them nothing to make that change.
And I want to add to that too, because I think that you hit it on the head when you said this is where we put people we don't want anymore. I think that we as Americans, we live in this disposable society, right? So, you know, we get a cup, we don't want it anymore, we throw it away. We get some kind of appliance, it doesn't work anymore, we throw it away. When you really look at how the whole African American experience, right? So you bring up a group of people here to this country to perform a job or a task that others didn't want to perform, right? And it was societally acceptable to do that. Then what happens? the acceptance in society changes. So now what do you have? You have people that you don't know what to do with necessarily. You have a cotton gin that comes in that can actually do better work quicker. You have a whole group of people you no longer really need. Unfortunately, you can't really send those people back because, you know, the generations have passed. And you're kind of stuck with this group of people, right? When you look at how we as a society do things, when we get tired of something, what do we do with it? We put it in the trash. Now, you know, we've moved into this this sustainability thing. So now we're trying to recycle and reuse and all that kind of stuff, right? So now the end thing is you're going to carry your water bottle with you. You know, you're going to shop at Goodwill. You're going to do all these things because it's now no longer socially acceptable to just throw those things away. But we haven't gotten that. We haven't gotten that way yet with people. So when you look at the high incarceration, that's a good place to put, you know, something that we want to throw away but couldn't. You look at Skid Row, yeah, we're going to go ahead and put you over there. You know, and this is something that I think we see not only in the Black community, but we're starting to see it in other communities of color. So for example, you know, we are now going to start using wind and solar. But you had generations of people, and I don't want to speak for the indigenous people, but I'm just going to point out that you had generations of them that worked in coal mines, that worked in power plants, that put their health at risk. But now it's no longer acceptable to use that type of energy. So we've kind of closed down all that, or we're phasing it out. And you have individuals who were making relatively good money, who were taking care of 15, 20 people off of that money in places that had high rates of unemployment. Now those people are unemployed. And the idea is we're going to put up a solar farm. Well, once you build the solar farm, you don't really need necessarily a whole lot of people to manage it. But hey, we are saving our planet, as we should. I want to be very clear. Everybody's listening. I think we should, right? But the fact of the matter is that you've also stepped away from this whole population of people of which you have built your businesses, your lives. All of us have utilized this energy, right? But now we're like, well, we're done with that. Good luck and make it the rest of the way. We as a society throw away people when we no longer need them to do the backbreaking work that we used to have to need them for. And I think that's another conversation that we need to have. You cannot just recycle clothes and water bottles, right? And cardboard and aluminum. You also need to be recycling people.
Well said.
Yes.
I'd like to just give an opportunity then for any closing thoughts from any of our panel. And one thing that I always like to try and do is have us end in that place of hope. We've talked about some of the problems, we've talked about the enduring and historical legacy of those problems, but what is our path forward? How do we move forward? You talked about solutions in your presentation, but if each of you could just share what's one thing that our audience should take away, or one thing that we should start doing that we're not, or one solution that we can bring forward that we need to consider as a community.
I can start off. One, I think that having conversations like this, I think this was a necessary conversation, and thank you so much for bringing me on board. But I think that bringing different communities and figuring out different solutions and the issues of those different communities, and so that we can all come up with a game plan together to fix this, because this isn't going to be an issue that just one locality fixes and others don't. This has to be an issue that we all address nationally. So I think that's really important, but I think that we're finally ready to have this conversation. That for so long in American history, we were so afraid to talk about money unless it was attached to some kind of moral, like attitude towards it. But I think now that we're realizing like the logistics behind money, how it frames every aspect of our life, but also how housing does too, and how housing is so important, and that we just didn't address it. We just allow people to live on the streets or to live housing insecure, as if that would not impact them or their children. And I think that's the big part of it, that these open conversations, yes, they hurt, but they're so necessary, and you can already see a movement trying to find solutions and to connect to resources and connect to other communities. And I think that's what I'm most hopeful about for the future.
I would say that I'm most hopeful about our young people. And so those of you that know me, I don't particularly care about people knowing my age. So at 67, when I look at the younger people that are still in my life, they give me hope. I watched some of them, not all of them, during COVID. I watch them now while they're, going through the neighborhood, participating in different activities or events. And so they give me hope. I hope that those young people will come to the table, because I think that that's a huge piece that we oftentimes want to leave out because we don't think they have really anything to offer to the conversation. And they think about life differently. Yeah, they want to save the planet, but they also want to save people. They're passionate about that. They care about people, and you don't have to look like them. And that's the and I watched that during COVID when the murder of George Floyd. I saw kids in the street that didn't look like me. A whole bunch of them, none of them looked like me. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? They care about people and they see things that are not right. So they give me hope. And so I just keep standing back here pushing them, in the right direction or in a good direction when I think they're going off. It's like, come back. And they do. So yeah, I think young folks.
I feel hopeful about a lot. And then some days I feel hopeless. I think that what I try to continue to challenge myself to do is to remain curious. Because I think that there's, a lot of opportunity if you continue to ask questions and ask why and ask for more than, how you can give more, how you can find a voice for people that feel voiceless. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity if we can stay hungry and stay curious for that opportunity, and continue to connect in places like this. I don't usually get to be the one white person on a panel. I'm usually among a bunch of white people and then one person of color representing. And so I think that I'm excited to have been able to be here with you all tonight and to share in this experience, and I feel hopeful about that. So.
And I think it is very awesome that you are here with us. And I think that maybe some of the conversation might have been difficult, but I like the way that you were part of our conversation, And I have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with a gentleman named Luther Lee. And he is Dene. He's originally from Delphi. And he is really educating me on a lot of different things. I had the opportunity to be in Window Rock and tour the museum there that is dedicated to the Treaty of 1867, something like that. I apologize, I don't remember the exact date. And learn about the horrific things that led up to that treaty and what has happened after the treaty. Quite frankly, what has not happened after the treaty. But one of the things when you walk through the gift shop after you leave the museum, and I went and I got it. It's this license plate, and of course I can't say it in Dene, but it translates into English. We are still here, right? And so one of the things that gives me hope is at the end of the day, guess what? We're still here, and it might be a good day that's really super hopeful, and it might be one of those days that you're just like, seriously? But at the end of the day, we are still here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for being part of this panel and being part of this discussion. Thank you to our audience that's here in person. It's so exciting to be able to have live in-person sessions. And also thank you to those who are joining us online. We appreciate you continuing to be part of the conversation, for recognizing that we are still here and we're still engaging our community in these important narratives and conversations and dialogues that are helping us to move forward as a community, to move forward as a society, and recognizing these social issues and talking about solutions that we can bring to the table. I'm reminded of a conversation that some of us had a while back when we were talking about the issues of housing and the communities of color. And we were talking about Ella's song. And we rewrote some of those verses to say that until the lives of Black boys, Black mothers' sons are as important as the lives of the sunflowers basking under the sun, we who believe in freedom will not rest until it comes. That is the message of hope that I am carrying out of this conversation. And I hope that those who are joining us tonight will join us in that conversation tonight and ongoing into our next one. Until next time, we thank you again for joining us. And as always, we say, go in grace.